Two friends meet up to drink some beers and talk about past times. Not yesterday, but long ago, it's scandals, wars and crimes. From Stalin's reign to Prohibition, Tudors, Pompey, Bush and NASA's mission, Edison's bulk, Genghis Khan's rise to victory. Forget your old teacher, it's time for Pint-Sized History.
Hi guys, it's Zach here. Just wanted to pop up before the show to tell you all about some changes we've had to the format for this and only this upcoming episode. Firstly, we're joined virtually today by Matt Lewis from HistoryHit, and because of the software we've used in the studio, our sound's gone a little bit strange at times, but just bear with us, we'll be back to regular formatting for the next episode. Matt is an incredible guy. He is a senior presenter at HistoryHit, co-host of the Gone Medieval podcast, and host of the Echoes of History podcast. He's also a well-renowned author on medieval history, and he's also a Wolverhampton Wanderers fan for his sins. I also mentioned in the upcoming episode that we've got a lovely discount code from the people at Crate Brewery, who've gifted us a special code which gives you 15% off their unbelievably refreshing beverages. That code is Pint-Sized 15, Pint-Sized 15, not 50, 15. Go get your hands on a crate or a beer just to show the support for the podcast, or just to try one of their delightful beverages, as we say. Anyway, thanks a lot. Enjoy the show. Hello there, and welcome to another episode of Pint-Sized History, the history podcast where we take you through the landmark events in the past that shaped the world we live in today. I'm Zach.
And I'm Joe.
And today we have a very special guest with us. I initially stumbled across our guest today when I was preparing for the Henry V episode we did by watching a video he had on YouTube about debunking the King movie. And I'd like to, formally introduce Matt Lewis from HistoryHit. Woo!
I'll give myself a round of applause as well. Thank you very much for having me. It's fantastic to be with you.
Great. How are you today, Matt?
I'm not too bad today. I've got some ciders lined up to join you in drinking as well. So
nice, perfect. What ciders are you drinking?
I have some Cider House Special, which
Lovely.
is from just down the road from me. It's established 1976, much like me, same year I was born. Tastes like apple juice. This stuff is lethal.
Perfect. That's exactly what we want to hear. We have got ourselves another sponsorship thing to shout out, which I can't believe, because I thought it might just be a one and done forever, but it turns out that Crate have offered to sponsor us once again. Ain't that right, Zach?
Clearly we didn't turn them off with the strange review from last episode, and they really liked it, and they've sent us loads more beers. So today I've got the Crate Brewery Pale Ale, which is
taste test live.
Oh, delicious. What an unbelievable tasting pale beer. Mm-hmm. I can't quite believe it.
Yeah. Well, meanwhile for me, I've got a Session IPA, which I've got over here, just hidden. Here's it on cam, and actually I'd have a little taste test as well. Then go on then. Oh yeah, that's an IPA. That's quite the IPA. I like it a lot.
If you would like to get your hands on a delicious pint or beer from Crate Brewery, and would like a discount code to do so, then Pint-Sized 15 will lead you to the glory lands of reduced prices.
Oh, reduced beers. Who doesn't love a reduced price beer?
Right. I can see Matt's getting bored now. So Matt, what are we talking about today?
I thought we would have a little chat about the Wars of the Roses.
Ooh, that's exciting.
So we are in 15th century, 1400s in England, and we're talking about what will begin as a squabble over who has the right to be the king's chief advisor, and it will snowball as the years go by, and it will turn into a dynastic conflict between cousins to rival houses for the crown of England, the House of Lancaster, who are sitting on the throne at the beginning of this period, and the House of York, who will eventually challenge them for that crown. And then later on, as we get further through the 15th century, the House of York will begin to implode a little bit, tear itself apart, and then we will get the arrival of the Tudors at the Battle of Bosworth in 1485, quite often seen as the end of the Wars of the Roses. It isn't even the last pitched battle of the Wars of the Roses. That comes a couple of years later. Normally we say 1455 to 1485, that kind of period of 30 years is the main part of the Wars of the Roses.
That's a long conflict. That is, that's not like a few years of warfare. 30 years is, a generational conflict.
Well, they've just come from 100 years war, right? Or they're still in the 100 years war, I think.
That's not usual, though, is it? That's not a very usual thing to happen.
We like our wars long.
We do.
We love a long war in the UK.
30 years is going to envelop a country. 30 years of warfare, between a civil war essentially is, that's pretty brutal stuff. And I imagine it is super brutal. Am I right in thinking so?
It's actually quite sporadic. So we'll cover 30 years, but what we're really talking about is kind of 3 or 4 episodes of really intense fighting and politicking. The battles are all quite clumped together. So in between them, you get 5 years, 10 years of relative peace where nothing is really happening. So it's not 30 years of solid, continuous fighting. The battles are all bunched together in these 3 or 4 groups of fighting, really.
Why is that? So in terms of like the fighting dropping off for like a sporadic break, like why is that? Because generally I think in the 100 Years' War fighting dropped off around the time of the Black Plague. So is it just like outside events that have just stopped people from fighting, or are there like various peace negotiations that are broken? I'm sure you'll dive into it.
It's hard work fighting. You can't just keep doing it endlessly all of the time.
So where do we get started then? What's the first flashpoint, I guess?
I think we need to put this against the backdrop of, as you said, the 100 Years' War has been going on. So it's going horrendously badly for England. Henry VI is king. He's the 3rd Lancastrian king of England. He's been king since he was 9 months old, since the death of Henry V.
Poor Henry. We recently covered Henry V,
yeah.
and
Rip in peace.
we hold him strongly in our hearts here on Pint-Sized History.
6'3".
Yeah, great hair, scarred cheek, but massive balls.
Yeah, a few war crimes in there as well. But,
Yeah, well,
who didn't?
Well, perhaps his biggest crime is leaving us with a 9-month-old baby on the throne who turns out to be an absolutely useless king.
Yeah, outrageous.
Not the 2,000 prisoners that were murdered at the Battle of Agincourt.
No, that's,
War's war, man.
War crimes, man. But baby in charge, not for me. That's where I draw the line.
Well, even the French didn't really think what happened at Agincourt was a war crime. They saw the justification for it. And ultimately, Henry VI being king will lead to thousands and thousands and thousands of deaths throughout the Wars of the Roses. So
Exactly. Blame the baby.
Yeah.
Always the way.
Damn kids.
So 100 Years' War is going horribly badly. There has been a big popular uprising in England in 1450 called Cade's Rebellion, in which a load of common folk from Kent invade London, hold London for a time. And all of this is because there are mounting problems in England because the war abroad is going really, really badly. It's costing money. It's getting embarrassing. No one likes to lose to the French.
Damn right.
Everybody's feeling deeply embarrassed.
Mm.
And by kind of 1452, 1453, the tensions at home are really ramping up. There is a feud going on in the north of England between 2 big families, the Percys and the Nevilles. They're coming to blows. The Percys will attack the Nevilles during a wedding party and all of that kind of thing. There is a big dispute in the southwest between a couple of rival families, and Henry VI is doing nothing to sort all of this out.
Is that because he's still a baby at this point? Or...
No, he's grown up by now. He's in his 30s now, but deeply uninterested in being a king. Nothing like his dad at all. 1453, he's on his way to go and sort out a dispute between the Earl of Warwick, the kingmaker, who at this point is still loyal to Henry VI. This is before the lines have really been drawn. But he's in a dispute over a castle with the Duke of Somerset. And the Duke of Somerset happens to be Henry's chief advisor, best friend, his current favourite. So Henry is finding in favour of the Duke of Somerset. The Earl of Warwick is refusing to go along with this. On his way there, Henry has a complete mental and physical collapse.
Oh.
To this day, we don't know precisely what causes it, but he becomes completely catatonic. There's been speculation it could have been some form of schizophrenia, but he has a complete physical collapse, complete mental collapse. He can't talk. He doesn't acknowledge anybody. He can't hold himself up. He has to be carried around everywhere. And at a time when government relies completely on the person of the king, this is considered an absolute disaster.
Quick question, I could be completely wrong here, but are favourites typically considered to be like romantic friendships? Because when I think favourites, I think for queens and princesses or something to have favourites, it typically implies a romantic setting. And I could be dead wrong there. And I would assume the same for Henry having a favourite might be like some sort of homoerotic relationship, but I could be way out of line here, Joe. Don't look at me like that.
Calling Henry VI gay?
No, I'm not calling him gay. He had his favourites.
You've thrown that one in left field.
You're not wrong. It does quite often have those connotations. So you think of Edward II and all of his favourites. There are lots of rumours that he was bisexual. He had children with his wife. He had illegitimate children with mistresses. But there is also suggestions that he was engaged in homosexual relationships with men that were considered his favourites. There are other kings to whom that applies. Henry VI, I don't think it's the case here, because this is a guy who is pretty much asexual. He's barely interested in his wife. You know, there is a story that he has to have a sex coach come into the bedroom and teach him what he's supposed to be doing. It's a guy who's been king since 9 months. His dad's not been around. Nobody's told him the birds and the bees. He kind of has to get someone in the room to tell him how it all works.
How could he leave his son like that?
Not knowing how to
Exactly. He should have
put
left
his
a note.
willy in places.
He should have left a note at least. Just a
A
little
diagram.
Just just anything that could have helped him understand a bit better the world that he lived in. Did he? Was there? I know, obviously, you don't to a baby. Was there anything he left for his son that kind of not for obviously
the
birds
throne.
and bees, but I just mean like any? Did he leave someone in charge that he knew would help them become the right king? Was there any safety that Henry V did to help Henry VI be a good king?
There was, and it was immediately undone as soon as he was dead. This is part of the problem that kings have when they die and they can't rule from beyond the grave kind of thing. So when Henry V dies, he sets up this system where his oldest remaining brother, John, Duke of Bedford, will be regent in France. Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester, who is their youngest brother, will be regent in England. And as soon as Henry dies, the council kind of tears this up and they think, hang on, we don't particularly like this idea. We don't care what happens in France. So John can go and be regent in France. That's fine. But we're not having all of the power in England vested in this one man, because then we don't get any of it either. So they tear up what Henry wanted to do in England and they create this idea of a council that will rule on behalf of the king, and they divide the responsibility. So then the protection and the raising of the king is handed over to a series of noblemen who have a tendency to die in fairly quick succession of being given these roles. So there is someone who is given the job of teaching Henry how to become a man, but nobody does a very good job of it. He goes through 3 or 4 tutors and certainly nobody seems to have told him what he should be doing on his wedding night.
Right.
Is there a lot of like subtlety and deceit that's going on? Like a lot of assassinations and murders when someone is in, like, second in line or third in line.
I think there's always fear that when anybody gets power during a regency, so if there is a single regent, they will have so much power and authority. And when it's a 9-month-old baby, you're going to hold that authority for at least 18, maybe 21 years, because no one's quite sure when a king really comes of age. It could be 15, could be 18, could be 21. Is that person ever going to hand that authority back? Now, the power of a king is something that only kings chosen by God are meant to wield. What do you do when you give it to a person who isn't destined for that? And then how do you take it back from them? How do they go from having all of that power to stepping back and being a subject to somebody else then? So there are lots of questions swirling around about how this is going to play out. And their solution is essentially to have this council that will rule instead. So kind of as soon as Henry V is dead, all of his plans for his son's raising, his son's upbringing, are torn up and thrown out the window.
Totally fair. Well, he's screwed. Start the war.
He's
I reckon.
gone. Let's fight.
So kind of 1453, Henry's had this complete and utter collapse. The problem that he's had is that throughout his reign, there has been 2 emerging factions at his court. Initially, they were led by that Uncle Humphrey that we talked about, who's never quite got over the fact that he was shoved aside by the council, never ever thought that was fair. And Henry's great uncle on the other side, a man named Henry Beaufort, who was the Bishop of Winchester and will become a cardinal as well. So Henry Beaufort, Bishop of Winchester, tends to favour peace with France, and Humphrey, who fought at Agincourt, who was knocked over in the front lines at the Battle of Agincourt and was rescued from certain death at the hands of the French by his big brother. Henry V stepped over Humphrey's body and fought the French off while his men dragged Humphrey away. So this is a guy who feels like he owes his life to his big brother. And the way that he sees to repay that is to continue Henry's legacy of war with France, complete the conquest with France. So those 2 factions kind of emerge. Henry is utterly incapable of reconciling them. He just simply doesn't know what to do. He's just floating around somewhere in the middle, trying to please everybody. When those 2 men eventually die at the end of the 1470s, the faction and the cause doesn't die with them. So Bishop of Winchester's faction start to back his nephew, the Duke of Somerset. And that's where the Dukes of Somerset will take on a key role in the Wars of the Roses. Humphrey, Duke of Gloucester's supporters immediately go behind the Duke of York, Richard, Duke of York, who Humphrey had always identified as someone else who was being unfairly excluded from government in the same way that he was. So this faction just continues into the next generation. And it's Somerset and York who will squabble over who has the right to be at Henry's side as his chief advisor. York takes an army to Dartford in 1452 to try and impose himself on Henry. Henry agrees to arrest York and try him for treason for things that have happened in France. When York goes to Henry, he finds he's been tricked. Somerset is standing there. York is paraded through London as effectively a prisoner and made to swear this embarrassing oath to never take up arms against the king ever again. So Henry is kind of completely messing up dealing with these factions. 1453, when he has this complete and utter collapse, there are then two options for who should be in power and authority. No one actually seems to like the Duke of Somerset, so he very quickly is a no-no. But he's also quite close, and we should probably do the close in air quotes, in similar fashion to being a king's favourite. Right. He's considered to be close to Margaret of Anjou, who is Henry VI's ill-satisfied wife.
Right.
So she puts a case forward to say, I could be regent on behalf of the king. And at this point, she's also pregnant. She's due to give birth to a son who lots of people will claim is the Duke of Somerset's son. I don't particularly think that's true, but it's kind of mud that you sling at a woman in the medieval period.
Right.
So she puts in a bid for the regency, and it's kind of, you can feel in the chronicles, you can feel all the noblemen of England going, a French woman in charge.
Not sure about that.
Yeah.
I don't think that's going to work.
French man? No. French woman? Hell no.
No, definitely not.
Definitely
My
not.
goodness me. God wants a French woman in charge of my country?
I think not.
No way in hell.
Yeah, and I think that's almost exactly the debates that's going on in England. So the only other option they can turn to is the Duke of York. So he's been out in the political wilderness a little bit. He's suddenly dragged in, and he's given this role of protector, which gives him military authority in England. So that's the very specific role of the protector. He's in charge of homeland security, if you like. If an army was to go abroad, he would be in charge of that too. But it doesn't put him in charge of the government, because we're still going to have a situation where the council is ruling. York has a position on the council as one of its members, but he's not considered the ruler of the country on the basis of being protector. So Henry then is ill for about 18 months altogether. He recovers on Christmas Day, 1455. So to many people, this is a Christmas miracle.
A great present.
Lots of historians have said afterwards that, if Henry's illness was a national tragedy, then his recovery was a national disaster, because things have been going quite well while he was off the scene. York's been doing quite a good job, and nobody is particularly upset apart from the Duke of Somerset, who's in prison.
He thinks he's come back, and he's like,
I'm back,
everyone. Here we go. Everything's going to be sorted out. I was like, fuck. We were doing so well. We had such good innings. Damn it.
I'm back. Ready to do it all over again. Can I just ask quickly, what role is Parliament playing in this? Because, as eagle-eyed listeners of the... Eagle-eyed listeners? Is that a phrase?
Yeah, sure.
Joe pouring his beer saying, sure, whatever you want. Eagle-eyed listeners of the podcast will know that I work in politics.
No.
So, and I know...
Do you?
Thanks, mate.
Well, no way.
And I know that Parliament has an incredibly reduced role at this time. It's not particularly strong or powerful as any sort of real influence besides the collection of taxes. So are they just kind of silent throughout this entire process? They're not saying much or holding the Duke of York to account? And is he the grand old Duke of York? Or just the Duke of York at this point?
He's not the grand old Duke of York. That's another Duke of York. He's just the Duke of York. Parliament is growing in authority by this point. By the time we get to the middle of the 15th century, Parliament is a key body in ruling the kingdom. So it begins in the 13th century as a body that grants taxation to the king in return for reforms, largely against Magna Carta.
Right. Okay.
Over the decades and centuries that follow, it begins to gather more and more power to itself until we get to the end of the 14th century when Richard II is deposed. He's deposed in Parliament because nobody's sure of the legal way to do that. No one's quite sure how you get rid of a king. So 1327 when Edward II is deposed and 1399 when Richard II is deposed, the only way they can think of to try and make sure it sticks is to do it in Parliament. But this also accidentally grants Parliament a huge amount of authority, because suddenly they are able to say who is and who isn't king anymore.
Right.
So by the time you get to this period of the Wars of the Roses, getting the support of Parliament, if you want to change who's on the throne, is key to doing it, because that's the body that will legitimize whatever king is sitting on the throne. So throughout the Wars of the Roses, Parliament is sitting and it is doing work. And, Parliament appoints Richard, Duke of York, as protector, because again, no one's quite sure. The king should be doing this, but when the king isn't there, how do you do something that's legal? And people think that the only way you can do this is Parliament. So they put all of this stuff through Parliament, and Parliament is debating the extent of York's authority, and it's Parliament that grants him that office of protector. But in the process, they're actually giving Parliament an awful lot of power and authority that they're then going to struggle to take back off them.
Yeah, you don't want to give those pesky politicians any power. You give them an inch, they'll take a mile, they will.
So essentially, Christmas 1455, Henry recovers, and the first thing that he does is kick York out of office and get Somerset out of prison and put him back in charge of the government. And Henry's going, yay, I've fixed everything. And everyone else is going, we're right back in the mess we started off in.
I'm going to lose my job.
I'm really panicking. I'm going to lose my job. It plods along in this kind of Cold War stalemate for a while, with these two factions, the Duke of York, who by now has got the Neville family, which includes the Earl of Warwick, the kingmaker, on his side. They've kind of been alienated by the way that Henry's been ruling. On the other side, you've got sort of Henry, Queen Margaret, the Duke of Somerset. You've got the Percy family because they hate the Nevilles. So if the Nevilles are in York's camp, the Percys are in the royal camp. And across England, you've kind of got these petty local feuds being played out by picking a side in this national dispute. So whenever we talk about the Wars of the Roses and we think about the big dynastic struggle between Lancaster and York, we also need to be aware that there are dozens and dozens of local feuds being played out on these battlefields too.
That specific sentence reminds me so much of the fact that obviously George R. R. Martin had Game of Thrones inspired by War of the Roses.
Inspired by War of the Roses.
And you can't do something like Game of Thrones unless you've got all of the houses having their own, everyone's got their own motive. Everyone's got their own reason to fight. Everyone's got their own thing that they want. And that's what makes the TV show so enthralling, but also makes, this conflict so interesting, is that everyone's got an ulterior motive that might be behind the scenes or might be more obvious, but there's always something that someone wants. And it's about figuring out what exactly it is.
So taking Game of Thrones into account, who are the main players in this story? In the Wars of the Roses,
are you a fan of Game of Thrones? Firstly, okay. I presumed as much, but I wasn't sure. So
I would assume Henry at this point is probably like Robert Baratheon, maybe, and then Cersei. Oh, God, this is gonna be tricky.
George R. R. Martin does jumble the timeline a little bit, so I would say Robert Baratheon is a lot like Edward IV, who comes a little bit later in the story of the Wars of the Roses. If we're looking for someone who is, lots of these characters are composites, so they're not necessarily all one person. But the story of Richard, Duke of York, I think, is a strong parallel with Ned Stark. Okay. So the guy who comes south, tries to rule, tries to do the right thing, tries to work alongside the king, but is ultimately kind of loses his head because of his principles, kind of thing.
Right.
Cersei Lannister, you can maybe see a bit of Margaret of Anjou in her in playing the political games, but also someone like Elizabeth Woodville might fit in there, Edward IV's wife, when we get to that bit too. There are lots of composite characters, and it is quite fun, if you know the Wars of the Roses, to read or watch Game of Thrones and try and pick it apart and see, Tyrion Lannister, I think you can see a bit of Richard III in there. Right. The idea of a physically different person and what that means. Everyone views Tyrion as this evil little imp who's always up to something, and to some extent he is, but also he really isn't. And it's the way that people judge him for his physical appearance. Right. Kind of plays in a little bit about Richard III. So I think you can have fun kind of with Game of Thrones, picking the Wars of the Roses characters out of it.
Apparently the portrayal of Tyrion in the TV show versus the books is like starkly different. Supposedly have you read the books?
I have, yeah.
Supposedly in the books he is an evil little fucker. Can I say that? Is that a bit charged?
No, I think that's fine. I mean, it's like, I guess if you're saying little in that context, I thought you just meant his personality, but I didn't realize.
No, I'm saying it in his personality, but sorry, I apologise.
That's not the right.
You'll be fine.
Peter Dink, if you're listening, he doesn't mean that. I don't know. I think, from what I've read, so because I haven't read all of them, he can be a bit of a nasty little prick at times. I'm just on the same thing myself. I didn't mean to do that. Just meant about his personality.
The way they pervert it a little bit to show Tyrion Lannister and people think he's just this like really lovely guy, but he's actually just like a horrible.
He has to be one of the protagonists, and that's how it would be.
Yeah.
And I guess in War of the Roses, often the protagonists depend on what side you're on. Like you could argue, you could put a case for all of them if they in some way or matter are a protagonist or the main protagonist of the story. And I'm sure there's plenty of different books and stories that portray different characters from that saga as right or wrong.
I think Game of Thrones does a really good job of making the point that everybody is the good guy in their own story. Nobody wants to be the bad guy in their own story. Everyone is their own hero.
Right.
What they probably think what they're doing is right. Just someone else will think it's wrong.
Yeah. Yeah. No, I think that's one of my favorite parts about the show. And I imagine, and it makes sense within a real life context because it's always the case for everyone.
Just to, I guess, in the backgrounds, or just to get your opinion on it, who do you think in this story are the goodies and the baddies, if there are ones? You would say probably the Duke of York seems like, off in the face of it, the goodie. And the the Lancastrians would probably be the baddies.
My historian hat says there are no goodies and baddies in history.
No, take a side, Matt.
I'm always on the Yorkist side. So there are lots of people who think the Duke of York is just a insanely ambitious man who is desperate to make himself king. I don't see that at all. I wrote a biography of him. I actually found myself liking him a lot. I think there is much more to him than is generally allowed. I think he's a much more noble figure than he's often portrayed as too. So I'm a Ricardian. When we get to Richard III, I'm a believer that Richard III is nowhere near as bad as history has portrayed him. So I guess, if I'm picking a side, I'm coming down on the side of the Yorkists.
Come on, you York. Come on, Yorkies.
A Yorker York would be the battle cry.
Yorkie York.
A Yorker York.
A Yorkie York. A Yorker York.
Is that what they said, charging into battle?
A Yorker York. That's what he said. A Yorker York.
Why are you doing that accent?
Because I'm not from York.
I don't know if would they have Yorkshire accents. I presume they would, but
some would. So part of the thing about medieval English titles in particular is they often don't bear much resemblance to where people's power bases are.
Yeah.
So the Duke of York's power base is much more on the borders of Wales. He's got scattered properties all over England, but actually very little in Yorkshire. So Henry VI has recovered from his illness. He's kicked York out of government. He's brought Somerset back. No one is particularly happy about this, apart from Henry, who probably thinks he's great. By May 1455, he's kind of summoning this great council to sit in the Midlands. He gets York and his allies an invitation to this. They are probably not unreasonably suspicious that this might be an effort to assassinate them. It's kind of happened before. It's how Henry's uncle Humphrey ended up dead. He was sort of snaffled away at a parliament, taken into custody, and mysteriously died. So they march to intercept Henry as he's moving towards the Midlands, and they catch up with him at St Albans. So the 22nd of May, 1455, we get what's known as the First Battle of St Albans. So spoiler, because it's the first one, there's going to be another one.
Ooh.
It's quite an unusual medieval battle because it takes place in the streets of St Albans. So normally they would happen in a big open field where you can have cavalry charges and you can have lots of space for the men to fight. But there is some negotiations before the battle. Nobody gets anywhere. York eventually begins an attack on the gates of St Albans where the king is inside. The Earl of Warwick takes a small contingent of men round the side, manages to find some gardens that he can break into, gets into the town, and he finds the king and the main body of his army in the market square, kind of unprepared. They're not got their armor on or anything like that. So he has his archers unleash all of their arrows. Henry is wounded by an arrow in the neck. The Duke of Buckingham takes an arrow to the face. All sorts of people are injured. It causes chaos, and essentially it ends in the Yorkists winning the battle.
Wow.
The Duke of Somerset is killed during the fighting. The Percy, Earl of Northumberland, who is the Neville's rival, is killed. So this is not unlike a hit. There are people that they are targeting, their political enemies, making sure that they don't make it out of St Albans alive. The Duke of York finds Henry with this wound in his neck, and if he was madly ambitious for the throne, here's a chance to slightly widen that cut and go, oh dear, poor old Henry, isn't that a shame? I'm king. He doesn't do that. He goes down on one knee and he pledges his allegiance to Henry, has taken to St Albans Abbey for treatment, takes him to London and has him ceremonially recrowned. But York also takes the reins of government again and has himself reinstalled as protector. So he sits in his second protectorate here. Again, York is ruling pretty well. He's pretty good at this, actually. But he tries to bring an act before Parliament called an Act of Resumption to take back lots of gifts that Henry's been giving away. So the royal debts stand at what would be the equivalent today of something like £135 million that Henry owes and he has no way of paying. They can't get food delivered to the royal kitchens because they're not paying anybody. Henry is ridiculously generous to the point where that on one occasion he gives the same office in the West Country to two different people on the same day because they both asked nicely. So then he just creates a fight between the two of them about who is the rightful holder of this office. So this man is just causing endless problems with his ridiculous generosity. So York brings this act of resumption to take back some of these gifts, but that has to go through Parliament. And who's sitting in Parliament? A whole bunch of people who've done very well out of Henry's ridiculous generosity. So they don't like the thought of that being taken back off them. They wheel Henry back out and effectively have York kicked out of government again into the wilderness and Henry VI back in charge. We then get this several years of effectively kind of Cold War stalemate going on. 1458, Henry organises what's remembered as the Love Day because he decides that finally, 37 years into his reign, he's finally going to sort out all of these problems. He makes the Yorkists take the blame for everything that's gone wrong ever in the world since the beginning of time, makes them pay fines and all sorts of stuff, and then has this Love Day parade at St Paul's Cathedral in London with all of the opposition sort of walking side by side, holding hands. So Richard, Duke of York, is holding Queen Margaret Anjou's hand. Behind them, you've got the Duke of Somerset holding one of the Neville, Earl of Salisbury's hands. And you've got to imagine how like sweaty and uncomfortable that is, because these people hate each other's guts. And I imagine them like, when you try and roll someone's knuckles and squeeze them really hard while you're holding hands, lots of that, lots of sweatiness, lots of cheesy, teethy smiles that nobody means. The only person who was fooled by this is Henry, who thinks he's finally resolved all of the problems with the kingdom. Aren't I amazing? Everyone's happy.
God, I just can't stand Henry. I can't stand him. He's got no clue. He's got no political nous. He's got no idea of what he's doing, man.
He reminds me of Liz Truss. That is like the modern day equivalent of Henry. Like, I was just thinking that like the giving off way more than we always get Pint-Sized political a little bit. But it's just so right. It's just making the wrong decisions constantly.
You know what?
Pulling away the good people, bringing quasi-quarting when you got Jeremy Hunt there.
Yeah, I was going to tell you off for going Pint-Sized political, but you know what? That was a
it's a good one.
I actually quite like that one.
It's not an unreasonable comparison, but imagine we're like 36 years into Liz Truss's rule by now.
We were
Getting
wasteland
shivers.
right now. It'd be like the winter discontent again, I guess.
So yeah, Love Day, fools nobody. Everybody goes back to their homes and is kind of waiting for who's going to make the first move. And the first move comes from the Duke of York, who at his base in Ludlow on the Welsh borders begins to gather a huge force to him. The Earl of Salisbury, who is the leader of the Neville family. Confusingly, he's the Earl of Salisbury, but he's from the north of England. So again, ignore the title. But he's bringing an army down and is intercepted by an army that's been gathered by Queen Margaret of Anjou to fight in the name of her son, the Prince of Wales. And Salisbury defeats this army, gets to Ludlow. They march out from Ludlow and it looks like they're heading to London. So possibly to do again what York had done at Dartford, to impose himself on Henry as the rightful kind of chief minister. Albeit he's probably not going to be fooled as easily this time as he was in Dartford when he was tricked by Henry. They don't get much further than Worcester when news arrives that Henry is marching towards them at the head of a huge army, and Henry is in his armour flying a banner. And this is not like Henry at all. This is a guy who doesn't fight. Nobody's ever seen him like this. This is new stuff. They panic and they go back to Ludlow. The army follows them. The Royal Army follows them all the way to Ludlow. Then essentially you get on the 12th of October, 1459, what's remembered as the Battle of Ludford Bridge, but really there is no battle because part of the Yorkist army defects in the night, takes with them details of the Yorkist defences and plans and stuff. So all of the Yorkist lords scarper. They flee in the night. York takes his second son, Edmund, and they go to Ireland. His oldest son, Edward, with the Earls of Salisbury and Warwick, father and son Nevilles, go to Calais. Mm-hmm. Ludlow is ransacked by the royal army as punishment for supporting York. There then sits a session of Parliament, which is later remembered as the Parliament of Devils, in which York and all of his allies are attainted, so they're declared traitors and stripped of all of their lands and titles.
Oh, wow.
And to a medieval nobleman, this is worse than just dying or being executed.
Yeah, it's tyranny.
Well, your big job, if you're York, if you're the Duke of York, your main job is to hand everything to the next generation, at least intact and preferably doing very, very well. So if you lose all of your lands and titles, you don't want to be remembered as the man who did that, who completely ruined your family. So this is kind of worse than just being executed or just dying for York. And I think it's at this point where he's left with nothing left to lose. He's got nowhere left to go. He's backed into a corner and sort of forced to come out swinging. Mm. So from Calais, you get Edward and the Earls of Salisbury and Warwick invade the south of England. They're quite popular in London, so they're welcomed into London. They lay siege to the Tower of London. We get a moment during this where the guy in charge of the Tower of London, Lord Scales, orders wildfire to be used against the crowd as they're surrounding the Tower of London. So think Game of Thrones. It's exactly that. Yeah. It's like medieval napalm.
Really?
They're pouring this stuff down on the crowd. And it's this sticky substance that ignites and can't be put out. If you jump into the river, it burns even more intensely. So the Thames is aflame. There's people running around screaming in the streets of London. And Lord Scales is doing this to his own population.
Bloody hell.
And he's a Lancastrian. So that's
yes.
Not going to do great for the popularity of the family.
Eventually they will take the Tower of London and they continue north and they find Henry and his army. They defeat them at the Battle of Northampton. Henry is captured and taken back to London. And then several months later, the Duke of York arrives back from Ireland, but he lands in England flying the banners of the King of England and having a sword carried before him, which is a really clear statement to anyone who knows what they're looking at, that this is a man claiming to be the King of England now.
What do you mean, sorry, the sword in front of him? As in...
So you just having an unsheathed sword carried in front of you is kind of the act of a king.
Okay.
Oh, wow.
As in, but that what? So in general in English history, if a king is touring the country or staging a campaign, would that be a usual thing, or is it more for usurpers?
Could be, yeah. So an unsheathed sword is a symbol of a king's power and authority. So when you undergo a coronation, there are 3 swords that are used in the coronation because they're so critical to the image of the king as kind of the chief knight of the kingdom, the protector of the kingdom. So the symbol of York having the sword carried in front of him unsheathed would be clear to anyone who cared to look at it.
Interesting.
That he's claiming authority as king now.
Fair play.
I might go outside and unsheath my sword.
Oh, I hate the way you looked at me after that. You were like, give me credit. Yeah, I could see it in your eyes. You were looking for that big laugh from me, and I was like, oh, I'm cringing. I wish the camera was looking from where I was.
We'll wait till we're off camera for the unsheathing.
Oh no, please let me get away before anyone unsheaths.
I think the air would be cleared if we were just unsheathed already.
Oh, that's certainly what all these usurpers would think, wouldn't they? I should be king. Just starts whipping it out. A sword,
a sword, of course.
A
sword.
Jesus. Get your mind out the gutter.
So the Duke of York has landed with his sword unsheathed.
Mm.
The unsheathed Duke of York marches his way to London.
Nice.
He arrives at Westminster Hall in October 1460. Parliament is in session. He marches down the centre of Westminster Hall, up the steps to the raised dais, which is still at Westminster Hall today. You can go and see it under that magnificent hammer beam roof. There is an empty throne on there with the king's cushion on it. Henry isn't sitting on the throne at this point. York walks in, up to the throne, puts his hand on the cushion, very clearly again, claiming the throne. He's now saying, I am the rightful King of England. And he is met by rapturous silence.
Not
Yikes.
applause.
Just like what would have happened if you'd whipped it out just now. Just me and Matt just completely silent. Just
There will be gasps.
gasp. Who's gasping? No one's
You go,
gasping.
wow.
No one's gasping. This ain't a gasp off, brother.
Yeah, laughs is probably more accurate.
Yeah. Well, fair play to him though, because that takes balls of steel.
Yeah.
To whip it out, put your hand down and go, "This is mine," and then for everyone else to go, "Yikes!" that's tough. That's tough for him. I feel for him a little bit.
In the midst of this silence, the Lord Chancellor comes up to him and says, you can't just walk in here unsheathed like that and lay your hands on things. So ultimately, then you get this big debate in Parliament. And I always say, if medieval Parliament roles can ever be funny, it's almost like slapstick watching this back and forth from people trying to judge who has the better claim to the throne, because nobody wants to be the one who makes the decision. So everyone is saying, well, I can't possibly judge this, ask them. And they're saying, well, if they can't judge it, neither can we, so go and ask somebody else. And eventually all of the lords are sent home with some homework to find objections to York's title. They can't really find any that stick. So they arrive at this compromise called the Act of Accord. Henry will remain king for the rest of his life, and then York and his heirs will succeed him. So Richard, Duke of York, is now effectively Prince of Wales. Henry has disinherited his own son. Nobody is particularly happy about this because Henry's still king and he's a bit rubbish. But actually, his open-handed generosity suits some people. York is 10 years older than Henry, so possibly never likely to actually be king himself,
Right.
if that's what you think he wants. Henry's wife, Margaret, is really not happy that their son has been disinherited now. So nobody is really happy with this compromise that they've arrived at.
Yeah.
And it doesn't last for very long. We end up with Margaret will make it to Scotland, raise an army there, bring them south. York takes an army north to try and confront them, ends up at the Battle of Wakefield on the 30th of December, 1460, at which York and his second son Edmund are killed.
Oof.
A little bit later, on the 2nd of February, York's oldest son, Edward, fights a battle on the Welsh marches called the Battle of Mortimer's Cross. He defeats a Lancastrian army led by Jasper Tudor, the Earl of Pembroke, who is the uncle of the future Henry VII.
Okay.
Edward, at this point now, becomes the senior member of the House of York. So his father's been killed. He's now Duke of York, briefly. And Edward is this kind of 6'4", 18-year-old, hugely impressive young man. He will be undefeated on the battlefields of the Wars of the Roses, which not many people can say. One of those kind of magnetic personalities that everybody likes. He's Henry VIII's grandson, so whatever charm Henry VIII had, I think this is possibly where he's getting it from his granddad. So
I'm drawn to him.
Bet you are.
I'm unsheathed and I'm drawn to him.
How we can't keep doing such sheath jokes, man.
you and all the wives of 15th century London are drawn to Edward IV.
Can you blame us?
No.
Edward will get to London and he will be asked to take the throne. Everyone will say, that's it. We've had enough of Henry. They've clearly breached the terms of the Act of Accord. You're king now. Edward accepts, but refuses to undergo a coronation while there's still an army in the field for Henry. So they march north and we get this apocalyptic battle, the Battle of Towton, which is often remembered as the bloodiest battle ever to take place on English soil. The numbers are probably significantly exaggerated. We do get reports from immediately after the battle from eyewitnesses who say that there were up to 30,000 people injured or killed. But that seems like an exaggeration. I don't think there was that many people in one place at that time fighting. But the Battle of Towton kind of makes Edward the undisputed King of England. He goes back to London, undergoes a coronation, and is now the first Yorkist King of England. And then we'll get kind of almost a decade of peace. So 1464, there's a couple of battles at Hedgeley Moor and Hexham in the north of England when the Lancastrians try to ambush some of the Yorkist forces, but they're unsuccessful. They really don't do very well.
They're fighting like a guerrilla war at this point.
Yeah, so they're just desperately trying to keep the embers alive of Yorkist kingship.
Yeah.
Henry will be captured and put in the Tower of London as a prisoner eventually. Margaret is still on the loose. She takes her son to France. So she's a French woman. She goes to the French court to try to get some support there.
Yep.
But Edward feels fairly secure. His problem really comes when he begins to fall out with two people. So the Earl of Warwick, who we've already met, his first cousin, And he also falls out with his own brother, George, Duke of Clarence. So we finally got someone who isn't called Richard, Henry, or Edward. He's called George. And he is, a bona fide idiot. He just can't seem to control his temper. He just stamps around everywhere in a bit of a paddy all of the time.
Reminds me of Joe.
What? What have I done? Why am I catching strays with this silly George who hasn't got a fucking clue? Why am I involved in this?
All right, George. Throwing around a temper tantrum.
Let me sip my pint and pretend I'm not the dumb one.
We won't talk about how George meets his end being drowned in alcohol while Joe's taking a swig from that pint glass.
Oh no! What have I done? Is that actually how he goes? He drowns.
Supposedly, allegedly, yes. Yeah.
Nice.
1478. Edward IV has had enough of his brother George, Duke of Clarence, has him tried in Parliament, declared a traitor, and executed. And rumour has it that George is allowed to choose the method of his own execution, and he elects to be drowned in a vat of Edward's favourite Malmsey wine.
You're joking. He chooses it. I presume that it was just like, he was too drunk.
It's probably a good way to go.
Mate, fair play. But it's not even about, it's like, if it's a good way to go or not. Like, obviously drowning sucks. But for the rest of his days, for the rest of everyone's days, he'll be known as the bloke that drowned purposely in mulled wine.
Mulled wine.
Was that not it? Mulled wine? Was that
Malmsey wine?
Malmsey wine. I thought it was mulled wine.
Malmsey wine.
Yeah, it's
not very Christmassy.
There is a story. There is a portrait of the person believed to be his daughter, Margaret Pole, and she wears a barrel charm in the portrait. She's got a bracelet with a barrel charm on, and that's supposed to be a reference to her dad being drowned in a barrel of wine.
That's nice. That's good.
Warwick rebels, initially intending to put George on the throne, to kill Edward and make George king. When he can't make that stick, he ends up in exile in France, and the King of France puts him in front of Margaret of Anjou. So imagine the tense meeting that these two are having. He's the guy who caused Henry to be shot in the neck with an arrow at St. Albans. He's been at the core of the small group who have deposed Henry VI and disinherited her son, and now he's there asking for help. The chronicles tell us that Margaret keeps Warwick on bended knee for more than quarter of an hour while she has a good long think about whether she's going to go along with this or not. Nice. Even though it's pretty obvious that he's Margaret's only hope of getting anything out of this now. So she's just forcing him to stay there to try and prove her own authority in that moment. But they make an alliance. Warwick goes back to England and invades, and essentially he chases Edward out of England. He can't capture Edward, but Edward rushes to King's Lynn, gets on a ship and sails to Burgundy, where his brother-in-law is the Duke of Burgundy. Warwick wheels Henry VI out of the Tower of London, puts him back on the throne, but it's pretty clear that actually Warwick is ruling and Henry is just the puppet. And they're waiting then for Margaret and the Prince of Wales to come back to England. While they're waiting, Warwick is having trouble because none of the Lancastrians who are being restored to power trust Warwick because of what he did. Edward, over the next 6 months, undergoes something. I imagine this being like his Rocky training montage moment. There's lots of stories that Edward had begun to let himself go. He wasn't in great shape, gets kicked out of his kingdom, goes over to Burgundy. He's running up and down the steps to Mechlin Cathedral, punching on sides of beef and being chased down the street by Belgian children cheering him on, gets himself back into shape, gets together an army backed by the Duke of Burgundy, sails across to England, and it doesn't initially go very well for him. He has to say he doesn't want to be king anymore. He's only come back to be Duke of York again. But once he manages to get far enough south and gather enough support, he kind of sheds that pretense, says, ta-da, I am actually here to be king, fooled you all. He meets with the Earl of Warwick at the Battle of Barnet. So these first cousins fighting each other. And they fight in the early morning in the fog. So it's a completely confused affair. The armies line up off centre. It's a close fought battle for a long time. But in the confusion, the Earl of Oxford, who is fighting with the Earl of Warwick for the Lancastrians, his badge looks an awful lot like Edward's badge. So in the fog and the confusion, people get them mixed up. And everybody thinks everybody's fighting on the wrong side now. Everybody feels like they've been betrayed. It's utter chaos. But the Yorkists under Edward win this battle. The Earl of Warwick is killed. On the same day that takes place, Margaret and her son, the Prince of Wales, who is now 17, land on the south coast of England. And so they begin to move north. They're trying to rendezvous with some Lancastrian forces coming out of Wales. Edward gets back to London, gathers a fresh army and marches out to try and catch them, and eventually catches up with them on the 4th of May, 1471, at the Battle of Tewkesbury. And during that fighting, the Prince of Wales is killed. So the 17-year-old son of Henry VI is killed.
Named Henry?
His name's Edward.
Edward.
Oh, okay.
Oh.
So you've got King Edward IV, you've got Edward the Prince of Wales, and while Edward IV is in exile, his son is born, who is Edward the Prince of Wales, because he's Edward IV's son.
Right.
So there's two Edward Prince of Wales briefly in England. So Edward IV, back on the throne of England. Henry VI mysteriously dies.
Oh, shock.
Yeah. I'll leave that for you to decide what probably happened to him. Edward then rules in relative peace for the rest of his reign. 1475, he'll invade France, which he gets bought off by the King of France, so he gets a big fat pension instead of a war. 1478, he executes his brother George for his continual bad behaviour and betrayal. 1483, Edward IV dies completely unexpectedly at the age of 40. So this giant of a man on the battlefield, this great warrior, drops dead from a cold, we're told, at the age of 40. And he's succeeded by his 12-year-old son, Edward V. And we then get a whole tangle of uncertainty and controversy around what happens next. Essentially, what legally happens is that Edward V is declared illegitimate along with all of his siblings. There is a story that Edward IV had married bigamously, so all of his children were illegitimate. And so Edward IV's youngest brother, Richard, Duke of Gloucester, becomes king as Richard III. There's lots of questions then about what happens to Edward IV's son. They will be remembered as the princes in the Tower. Richard III will rule for 2 years. He's threatened by this figure on the continent, Henry Tudor, who is like the last remaining possible claimant of the House of Lancaster. And he will invade England in 1485, thrown over the Channel by France in an effort to distract Richard, who wants to go to war with France. And unexpectedly, Henry wins at the Battle of Bosworth on the 22nd of August, 1485, ends 332 years of Plantagenet rule in England,
Wow.
and begins the Tudor dynasty.
Here comes the Tudors.
And it's not quite the end of the Wars of the Roses. There will be Yorkist claimants who will come and threaten Henry's throne. But there we've got our kind of fairly neat 1455 to 1485 Wars of the Roses, crown changing hands numerous times, Plantagenet dynasty ended.
And the birth of the popular Tudors, who is the subject that we've been requested and have been planning to do for a long, long time. I mean, there's many different things you could do about the Tudors.
I low-key hate the Tudors.
Oh.
I think they're the worst.
I will make absolutely no secret that I despise the Tudors. There is so much more interesting stuff in history. People who study the Tudors need to get to grips with the Wars of the Roses. It's so much more interesting. It's so much more complex. There is so much more going on. There are so many more fascinating characters. The Tudors is like the easy cop out.
Well, it deserves a bigger and better deep dive. Essentially, you know, more than an hour that we've been able to have together, which we really appreciate. It's been so much fun to listen. It's also very refreshing to listen to a natural someone that knows so much more than what we actually bring week in, week out. So not only do we appreciate it so much, but it's easily an invitation for you to come back and dive deep into like a much bigger deep dive into, say, a battle or an event about the Wars of the Roses, or something completely different. Up to if you would be down, but we'd love to dig more into it because this is a subject that is easily more than an hour's worth of content.
No, it's been a pleasure. I'll come back anytime. I'll get some more cider and I'll be back.
Cheers, man.
Thank you for everyone at home listening. We hope you enjoyed the episode and learning a bit more about Wars of the Roses from someone who's a bบmore legitimately qualified to be able to do so than we are.
Yeah, especially you. And also thanks to Great Brewery because they have supplied us and with a lot, and we really do appreciate. We can't believe that we're at the stage now where we're actually being able to be supplied by beers from lovely companies such as this. So we really do appreciate it, and it does taste really good. I've been sipping away this entire time, so thank you so much, Crate.
Remember, pint-sized 15 when you go and buy your Crate beers, which you're going to do. And also, if you enjoyed the podcast, make sure to like, share, retweet, 5 stars,
subscribe,
shenanigans, everything. Follow.
Yes,
just do it all.
And also from Matt as well. Matt, cheers so much, mate. We've had a blast.
Thank you. It's been an absolute pleasure. And also listen to my podcast, Gone Medieval.
Yes. Oh, I meant to ask actually, Matt, do you have anything else you're up to besides just Gone Medieval?
Well, this Gone Medieval podcast, Echoes of History podcast, is a kind of companion to the Assassin's Creed games. So if you like Assassin's Creed and history, It's a perfect mashup. And I've written a few books as well, if you fancy reading any of those.
Ah, awesome.
Go buy a book, Pint-Sized 15.
No.
We'll work it out later, Matt.
Yeah, but yeah, thank you so much, mate. We appreciate it. Cheers.
Thank you.
Cheers.